the advancement of research on conflict and collaboration in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. It is a pleasure to have Farhana joining us, and we will now spotlight Farhana as well and allow you to share your screen. Thank you very much for coming, Farhana.
Thank you so much to colleagues and Scientist Rebellion for inviting me to speak today, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm just going to quickly share some slides because I'd like to just show some pictures along with what I'm going to be talking about. And if at any point, if anything's unclear, please do let me know afterwards. We have ample time for Q&A. So what we know is that issues around climate change are no longer a distant threat, right? They're quite a harsh reality right now. They've already been for some time, inflicting worldwide suffering in terms of severe storms, floods, wildfires, heat stress, rising sea levels, disrupted rainfall patterns that threaten food production, livelihoods, habitats, and way of life. And that evidence was quite stark recently, actually. If anyone will remember, last year, those images of post-apocalyptic orange skies over New York City from Canadian wildfires, or the unprecedented floods in South Asia the year before, the deadly heat waves in Europe, and then the typhoons in Africa and Latin America a couple of years ago. And then there are countless other frequent and recurrent incidences globally. And these are not isolated. They stem from a historical, political, geographical, and ecological set of factors that some scientists knew, many politicians knew, some citizens knew, but they weren't as clarified in their complexity in the public sphere and in public opinion as they have been in recent years. So what this escalating breakdown has done is that it has sparked heightened concerns, leading to a surge in research, publications, courses on climate justice, intensified media coverage, galvanized solidarity movements, increased political attention. But at the same time, what we've seen is, interestingly, more and more, those discussions around climate change and ecological devastations have finally reached the halls of power in the superpower countries of the industrial advanced world. So with politicians increasingly grappling with citizen demands for mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage, what we're seeing is that increasingly these processes are just very fraught. They're fraught with long-standing demands and critiques and battles that are often sometimes overshadowed by theatrics and lip service. And these negotiations can be quite contentious. The politics derailing resolution, they're fiercely contested while the harsh realities continue to play out because of delayed global action. However, a significant breakthrough came from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in late 2022. Because what they showed is that...
I apologize. Are you changing slides? Because it's still stuck to the first one. So maybe I apologize if I...
Oh, nope, I will shift it now. Okay.
Okay. Because we were not sure. Thank you. Sorry
for pointing it out. I didn't realize it hadn't shifted. My apologies. So in addition to what was happening globally and more awareness, we know that the IPCC confirmed in late 2022 that research evidence had shown colonialism's role in causing climate change over hundreds of years. Issues such as extensive extractivism, rapacious capitalism, resource consumptions, all the hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution and its spread through European colonialism have been identified as key drivers in many academic research publications, as well as in evidence that slowly started to emerge to the point where a global body like the IPCC included it in its latest summary reports. So while contentious geopolitically, what these revelations cemented was an understanding that climate change is a threat multiplier from the past into the future, not just from the present into the future. However, what the situation is characterized by is inequality, with impacts and responsibilities that are unequally distributed, often upheld by complex economic, social, and political systems. So confronting that ongoing colonization of the atmosphere, of science and systems and even minds becomes necessary to halt further planetary breakdown in order to achieve planetary justice. So what I want to do in this talk is basically look at what this decolonizing planetary justice mean. But first, let's talk about, well, what is at stake? So in recent studies, climate scientists have warned, quote, safe operating space for humanity, unquote, or what we know as planetary boundaries that the planet provides to us is actually shrinking. So environments around the world are recognized as being under grave threat from anthropogenic disruptions and destructions that go beyond repair and restoration. Collectively, these stressors and threat multipliers associated with anthropogenic climate change are disrupting the planetary limits of fundamental common pool resources like water, forests, fisheries, and even clean air. So what this work has done is it's predominantly focused on global scale analysis and frameworks, looking at the cumulative quantifiable indicators of biophysical boundaries and limits that can be monitored without recourse to questions of equity. So while useful for understanding and addressing global environmental challenges, they don't necessarily account for the uneven responsibilities and vulnerabilities that challenge the fairness and effectiveness of global environmental governance. It therefore raises questions about who gets to set these boundaries, what interests do they serve, and how the burdens of staying within these boundaries are shared. These issues are particularly pertinent given the historical marginalization of developing countries, or often euphemistically termed global south, voices in international environmental negotiations. Critiques of frequent discourses of we and humanity in planetary perspectives of the Anthropocene have been raised across disciplines and across activist groups because structural inequities in causation drivers are often under-theorized or even focused upon. So emerging areas of scholarship has sought to promote justice perspectives around access to resources and the sustainability of the system that underpin that access. So the crucial questions of equity that arise from both impacts and shared responsibilities surrounding the geopolitics of planetary environmental injustices have become more and more dire, but these questions have been more frequently raised. The unevenness of the outcomes associated with pursuing resource-based economic growth and biospheric exploitation have far-reaching consequences, both in terms of who benefits, but also where, why, and how. The global crossing of planetary boundaries is not the same everywhere, not contributed to equally by everyone. There are equity and justice considerations, as well as when considering responsibility and impacts. Indeed, any discussion on the limits and availability of planetary resources is a political issue that requires both regional and local applications and local global interconnections to be thoroughly investigated. This gives rise to more critical attention to climate justice.
Farhana, I
So
apologize
general,
again. I don't know if you are changing, maybe you're not changing the slides intentionally, but on Zoom it's always difficult to tell. Can you just...
no, I'm not changing the slides because I only have a few slides that I would just
Okay,
like
okay,
to
thank
stay
you.
on.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. So what this has given rise to is greater attention to climate justice. So in general terms, climate justice demonstrates how climate change is an ethical and justice issue, and it is not just a science or techno-managerial issue. Climate justice moves the conversation beyond the historic discourses of climate change to engage with its social impacts and outcomes, and therefore complicates those desires for planetary justice to be more thoroughly, again, investigated. Climate justice fundamentally addresses how climate change disproportionately impacts communities aiming to redress the resulting injustices and reduce marginalization and exploitation. Climate change is known to be a political issue, and when we apply a climate justice perspective, we have to investigate how both climate change and the actions taken to address it have varied outcomes. We have to focus on who benefits, who loses out, and why and where. Climate justice is thus an explanatory tool that helps us make better sense of the relationships at different scales that co-create and maintain injustices. So again, going back to how do we understand planetary boundaries and that distribution of burdens. What we do know is that climate change has resulted in that unequal burden, and it was actually identified all the way back in the 1992 Rio Earth Summit at the UNFCCC. And what that means is that they argued that there is a common but differentiated responsibility in tackling climate change. This was over 30 years ago. What was acknowledged was that there are some countries that have historically produced more climate pollution and therefore bear greater responsibility to address the problem, while those who have contributed the least are most unduly burdened and harmed by climate and ecological breakdown. So while fixing climate is everyone's problem, it is a greater responsibility for those who have colonized the atmosphere. What this means is they have released more greenhouse gas emissions and taken up more of their fair share of global atmospheric carbon budget. But it's just not atmospheric carbon budget, it's also biospheric, right, and hydrospheric resources. So as a result, the historical and geographical differences are increasingly brought to the forefront in all discussions around climate justice, instead of only talking about climate science. So issues such as exploitation, extraction, domination, and imperialism have come into sharper focus. Climate and ecological breakdown results from extraction, overproduction, overconsumption, and waste disposal that are very unequally and inequitably distributed around the world, mainly because of historical factors that produce that colonial capitalist system of unjust economic growth, geopolitical control, but also in terms of what we know, epistemic injustices, in order to pursue what globally we were taught to be prosperity. But now we know that what was before considered prosperity is actually quite harmful to humans and non-human species. So what I term this is climate coloniality. So climate coloniality is when variously racialized, marginalized populations, often in countries that were colonized by European colonizers or facing US imperialism, end up encountering disproportionate impacts of climate change and ecological devastations, and thereby are rendered more vulnerable. Their abilities to cope with, respond to, and adapt to climate impacts are curtailed from both historical and current factors. The uneven and unequal vulnerabilities and marginalizations of death and devastations taken for granted draw attention to the continuities from the past into the future. This is often known as a slow violence against the planet's poorest and the most vulnerable. Ongoing climate coloniality is expressed through insidious racism globally, through continued othering, creating disparate exposures to harms from more powerful climate-induced hazards and overlapping tipping points. It is also experienced through continued ecological degradations that are both covert and overt, episodic and creeping, whereby global capitalism articulates with economic growth ideologies to reproduce various forms of colonial racial harms to entire countries and communities across the global south and communities of color in the global north, but increasingly, as we've seen, almost everywhere, barring the super wealthy who seem to be able to protect themselves at any cost. What we've seen is that climate coloniality is perpetuated through global land and water grabs, deforestation for growth, neoliberal conservation projects, often called fortress conservation, also through fossil fuel warfare, green revolutions for agriculture, rare earth mineral mining, and carbon offsetting programs for the wealthy that are dispossessing the historically impoverished elsewhere. These interventions are called by various names and have different tenors, such as green colonialism, carbon colonialism, fossil capitalism, but often with very similar outcomes of displacement, degradation, and impoverishment. And this is creeping and increasing and escalating everywhere right now. But this extractivism propagated by global capital and state-sanctioned interventions perpetuate climate impacts within and beyond borders. However, despite decades of evidence of these escalating climate and ecological harms, there has been quite little mitigation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally. As a result, climate justice means elevating equity considerations to focus on actions that reduce and remove those harms and redress these inequities and inequalities that end up killing. What this does is makes underlying commitment to climate justice be quite a political one and one of solidarity. Critical approaches to climate justice look at not only issues of responsibility, exposure, vulnerability, and ethics, but also focus very sharply on accountability and obligations and human rights, because that's what justice is about. It means addressing the current global political economic systems that produce and reinforce harms and injustices across sites and scales. The goal is not to further burden impacted communities with further harms. So fundamentally, the considerations that are brought to the fore are about the role of power structures, and social disparities and economic ideologies, and how those are embedded within multiscalar issues such as political economy, development interventions, geopolitics, and trade. So when we think about more critical attention and importance being given to address these inequities, marginalizations, and vulnerabilities, what we need to keep our mind on is how these are continually still being created and reconfigured through not only the global systems, but now increasingly disruptive and chaotic climate patterns and related impacts, but also the solutions that are often pursued to fix them. So first of all, when I think about, well, what do we do about it? We can think about how capitalist elites globally lead that overconsumption and shape societal ideals. They influence perceptions of modernity in a desirable status. As a result, that model of hyperconsumption, extractivism, and a discard or throwaway culture of increasing waste production has tended to discount and throw away what we actually need to sustain our lives and the planet. Those boundaries that I talked about, those resources, those relationships we have. But the elites participate in that accumulation by dispossession, resulting not only in disproportionate capitalist benefits from resource control and promotion of neocolonialist policies, but also contribute to ecological harms, biodiversity crises, water and air pollution, and increasing climate breakdown that they often do not largely experience. And those boundaries that are being crossed largely by these elites and increasingly high energy using industrialized countries' own citizens end up causing disproportionate social and ecological harms to marginalized communities within their borders and elsewhere. The extraction and discard culture embedded in these processes and economic models, especially since World War II, include not just natural resource exploitation, but also destruction of human lives and potential, resulting in a discard of care economy, of thinking about care ethics and resilience of ecosystems, or often just lip service to the basic welfare of billions caught in exploitative and neocolonial labor relations, where global capital and extractive resource-based trade causes irreversible harm, but is footloose and fancy-free to roam the planet. What we do know is citizens of more advanced industrialized countries and increasingly elsewhere are caught up in a process that also makes them participate in this hyper-consumptive lifestyle. And they often feel that they're locked into systems of energy use via infrastructure, transportation, and agricultural modes of production that they feel that's outside of their direct control. But this is not fully the case, right? Because we know that regulatory changes is possible, as is cultural shifts and policy shifts that can and do occur. So what we need is a better understanding of the wider political economy that holds climate justice, social equity, and sufficiency at the heart of our discussions and our sense of well-being, rather than just consumption of goods and services. What we can think about is, how does that enable greater numbers of people to promote and benefit from systemic and cultural shifts? Clearly, those shifts are desperately needed. So some scholars have promoted delinking growth from well-being to confront this endless ecological degradation, but economic growth models that are increasingly being reinforced through both state and capital policies. So although this is challenging, it's not impossible. It just means that we need to have more intentional action and decision making. While it is challenging to accomplish quickly, they are possible over time. So what that means is the world that we inhabit, we have to see it as being created. It is created as a result of centuries of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, and destructive fossil fuel-based growth paradigms. The bill, which has historically been paid by ecosystems and communities of color across the global south, or what is known as the majority world, often split across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but increasingly everywhere. But we do know that the world that we inhabited, again, was created. It is not gravity. It did not fall from the sky. So when we think about, well, what can we do? One thing we can think about is, how is it that that destructive ideology that we take as a norm, that we seem to enjoy, are actually enrolling more and more people around the world into that similar style of hyperconsumption of material goods and high energy usage that end up limiting or curtailing a discussion about what well-being could be beyond pursuit of ever high GDP growth rates. But of course, having sufficient water, food, housing, education, employment, and healthcare are critically necessary. I'm not disputing that. What I'm talking about is the complete blind destruction that is pursued, or that is greenwashed or whitewashed, and end up creating this maldistribution of resource use and power relations. What we do know is that with intentional attention to the way that international development and globalization models work, the way media and pop culture and domestic policies influence by donors and funders and so on, that they end up enrolling more and more of these communities to become aspirational, to mimic these unsustainable Western or Eurocentric lifestyles and habits that we know are not helpful in the long run. This capitalistic developmental logic cannot continue unabated for everyone across the planet at this rate. Clearly, somebody is subsidizing our lifestyle. So when we know that these ideologies are often opposed by indigenous and local cultures and practices of what is known as sufficiency, care, sustainability, and reciprocity, these practices were eroded and devalued over the last 500 years because of that colonial capitalist rendition of modernity that traveled through European colonization and then through global imperialism. And this destructive model has gained speed through global policies, trade, imperial forces, and so on, particularly since World War II. But again, like I said, this was made, it didn't just happen. But at the same time, the speed of mitigation that's necessary to keep us within those planetary boundaries is not happening at that speed. That's kind of ironic, isn't it? So when we think about the biophysical resources globally that is not available to everyone spatially or societally for even basic well-being, we need to talk about what does colonization of the atmosphere really look like. It skews that accessibility and availability to a wide number of people of the resources that a small minority enjoy. And it results in enduring injustices since before the Industrial Revolution and will into the future unless there's concerted effort to do something about it. So this unequal ecological exchange drains not only material and economic resources from various impoverished and exploited communities, but it perpetuates that exploitative mindset that this is okay. that this is normal, that this is business as usual or BAU. So some scholars have quantified this unequal ecological exchange, demonstrating the destructive nature and the need for alternative models. They have called out ongoing colonial plunder of resources from the global south to the global north, one that leads to the overdevelopment of the global north or the advanced industrialized west at the expense of the former, which happen to be often former colonies, occupied spaces, or currently still remaining colonized. So such processes continue various colonial patterns of harm and dispossession from the past and into the future that I started with. What we know is that there's a funneling upwards of benefits to a few, but then the communities that are at the front line facing deeper and long-standing climate and ecological breakdown disproportionately feel the impacts of that boundary crossing and systems collapse. So that boundary crossing should never be considered to be something mythical, up in the sky. It is happening right now. And it is being felt by, but then also paid for by many that are not often in the halls of power. So what we see is that globally, as societies extract, produce, transport, consume, and disperse at greater and greater quantities and speeds, it is impossible to expect the system not to buckle, right? We know that this system cannot continue. And the challenges to intergenerational justice have to also consider intragenerational and spatial justice, accounting for the current and past impacts to marginalized communities. So reducing materials and energy throughput is certainly necessary for climate justice and ecological justice, but also for true decolonization and abolition justice, so that increasingly everywhere more people can benefit without the disproportionate inequity. What we need is greater investment in public services and basic human rights across the world, instead of perverse discursive and economic colonization that fetishizes growth of few at the expense of many, of further commodification and discard culture, and the policies that accelerate planetary boundary crossing. So what we know is that any discussion around sustainability needs to reckon more critically with the unequal distribution and unequal contribution to these scalar, biospheric, and atmospheric crises, and the political economy of that, as well as the uneven impacts and consequences. It also needs to reckon with how we can discursively and materially foster other notions of well-being and prosperity between escalating GDP and destructive hyperconsumption, and to encourage more practical and equitable alliances and real solidarities with social movements across the global south, from which lessons can be learned, trialed, unlearned, and relearned. So within academia, where I'm based, many types of scholarship have tried to put forth what we can learn from them in order to advance this more justice-oriented future. So feminist, decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-imperial scholars and activists of degrowth, post-growth, and post-development have demonstrated that we need to contend with intersectional impacts and outcomes, as well as alternative models of flourishing that exist, but have been unheeded or discarded in the past. And the way we understand the world, our knowledge base, epistemology, and praxis, which is practice based on theory and reflection. So our epistemologies and praxis of well-being and prosperity have to be therefore bolstered, have to be recovered, because they have been silenced and eroded over centuries. So many communities and scholars stress the importance of care, respect, relationality, well-being, and multi-species justice, and tending to the root cause of unequal power relations, injustices, and marginalizations. To achieve meaningful, equitable, and impactful impact on the climate crisis, such concerns have to be accounted for more concretely in discussions of planetary limits and planetary boundaries, as well as on any models of economic growth, capitalist, policies. But then also when we are told this is good for you, we need to question, what does it mean to be good for me rather than good for us? So when we recognize the similarities and differences between groups of people, that allow us to address the shortcomings systemically and frame policies for more equitable solutions, we can come to realize the importance that the goal is to elevate a range of voices so that marginalized peoples are heard and heeded in the corridors of power for more equity in society. That we have to recuperate lost knowledge. We have to listen to Indigenous voices. So, for instance, organizations and institutions are increasingly taking climate justice into consideration in funding priorities and interventions. What's happening is that we are seeing more and more, at least lip service, but also funding allocation towards more collaborative climate justice programs. And what has happened is that, yes, these international negotiations, such as at the COP or COP28 a few months ago, are quite difficult, right? Because nobody wants to take historic responsibility for both historical and contemporary global emissions. And that remains a major sticking point. But however, a lot of things can still be done in the sidelines and in the mainstream, in the main stage. So one of the things on the main stage is of climate finance, which has been slow in past years. But what this means is that climate finance from advanced industrialized countries to historically exploited and impoverished post-colonial and occupied countries should not be seen as charity or philanthropy, but rather as accountability and responsibility. Demands have been made of debt cancellation as part of climate reparations for countries and communities of the global south who have historically been impoverished and indentured through colonial and imperial finance mechanisms and capitalist extractivism fueled by neoliberal global trade and economic modeling. So while nobody wants to use the term climate reparations, we can think about responsibility and think about finance and also think about mobility justice for climate migrants or finance for loss and damage, adaptation finance to communities, but increasingly reduce fossil fuel dependency, tax fossil fuel corporations, increase decarbonization programs, and usher in a range of measures to bring down greenhouse gas emissions rapidly. What this means is these are actually components of climate reparations for colonial legacies of harm, even if nobody wants to use that term. What I want to say is that what we're seeing is a global shift in awareness of the interconnectedness across places and issues, not just focusing on isolated domestic solutions, but accounting for international externalities and impacts. So we need to understand where the knowledge gaps and actions are. So when we reframe climate debates with insights from solidarity work with communities, we end up unearthing problems. We can redress the root causes instead of just seeking out quick fix techno-managerialistic solutions. We can confront inequities in communities, institutions, and policymaking, recognizing the importance of intersectional analysis, disaggregated data collection, ethical research design, collaborative planning, critical advocacy, and much more. So while dominant discussions around climate change seem to make climate apolitical as some physical phenomenon to be fixed with technology and finance, instead of a restructuring of relationships to ecologies, waters, lands, and communities we are intimately, materially, and geopolitically connected to. However, we are witnessing global awareness of climate justice accompanied by increasing mobilization and action. We've seen various groups and organizations are making concerted efforts to collaborate with policymakers, politicians, students, journalists, and citizens to address ongoing climate breakdown at different scales. What the objective has been is to look at how global cooperation oriented towards justice and accountability can be facilitated, can be more understandable, and therefore easily taught and become a part of life. So changing the world's trajectory is entirely possible with greater political will, with people power, with decolonization of global power structures to achieve global climate and planetary justice. Political action can be revolutionary when it fosters that recursive care and collective well-being, addressing both societal and ecological aspects, and not only thinking myopically. So I want to conclude by saying that this crisis of climate coloniality and planetary injustices stem from a lack of democratic economic organization, of lack of institutional priorities of policy and of politics, and of very unbalanced and neocolonial geopolitical power relations. Necessary shifts include ontological and epistemological changes that prioritize futures focused on restoration, reparation, regeneration, care, kinship, dignity, and flourishing for all, rather than endless growth models on a finite planet. The planetary crisis is a product of colonial capitalism and imperialism. Decolonizing the current system requires fundamental reformulation of paradigms and solidarities rooted in justice and meaningful praxis, rather than token diversity or inclusion. And I believe that world is entirely possible. We are here to talk about it today, and I thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Farhana. Thank you very much for the incredible talk. And especially, I love in these conclusions some tools, some ideas that you provided us for identifying in our praxis policies in which directions they are going. Whenever it's important to keep a compass, an ethical, a political compass. Whenever something is not going in the direction of responsibility, decolonization, restoration, ecology, then we know it's going in some wrong direction. Maybe wrong, maybe clearly wrong, maybe less wrong, maybe someone will try to convince us, but this is just something intermediate, but we know what is the direction to take.
Right. Thank you. And I appreciate this talk and all the people who've joined us. But I just wanted to say that, if you wanted to learn more about these, on this last slide, I've put up some of the publications that are available on my website, which is literally my name. It's farhanasultana.com. I'll also put it in the chat box. And if you're interested in learning more, you can read about these, but then you can also think about the ways that perhaps your own work intersects with these, and how do we therefore push these ideas forward. And I think one of the things that's really important is that we continue to learn from each other. And my goal is that perhaps we do. And one last thing I'll just mention is that my forthcoming book that's coming out later this year is called Confronting Climate Coloniality, Decolonizing Pathways for Climate Justice. That should be out by the end of the year. So, if people are interested in learning more about that, they can certainly seek that out later this year. But, I'm happy to continue these conversations and encourage folks to, you're welcome to read any of my work, a work of other amazing scholars, listen to their podcasts and their talks.
Thank you so much for the precious suggestions. So while people can think of questions, either put in the chat or raise their hand, I just want to open up this debate and ask you something that you touched. One keyword in your talk that that was amazing was praxis. To take this into in the praxis, in the everyday action. And as scientists rebellion, we have some values, and we often talk with scientists from an ethical perspective, from what do we need to do, what is our role. But something that really struck me, it was amazing in your talk, was the focus on the political side. So the climate change is not only ethical. We will not have to act only because it's right. We will have to act because we will do something, because it's dangerous, because it's a political issue, and there are people that are winning out of this situation, and they are elites. So my question is, in your studies, do you have some group that you identify as the future carrier or these political praxis first? There will be some spark at some point of change, some actor that will take action. Do you identify it more being in the so-called minority world or in the majority world? Where do you find the sparkles of the change?
And that's a great question. So there's so many types of movements around the world. I think, one of the a set of communities that I learned the most from are various indigenous activist organizations, whether it's here on Turtle Island, which is the United States and Canada, but also in Africa and in Asia and Latin America, in terms of how they have survived centuries of colonial oppression and managed to still maintain that continuity in relationship to the earth and of treading lightly, but at the same time being quite savvy in terms of having conversations with Western science and melding with indigenous knowledge and indigenous science. So if you look at some of the findings from what are called indigenous or traditional homelands in parts of Africa or in parts of Asia, people were able to predict various forms of shifts in climate and seasonality and whether there would be a drought or not. But in many different ways, and that knowledge was communally produced, not just amongst humans, but humans and non-human others, right? And over time, and yes, it may not seem ideal for people who are very used to like complete capitalist lifestyles to think about a different form of relationship to the earth, but this type of lifestyle is not sustainable. So what can we learn from these groups? A lot of these groups are not necessarily out there politically, in the halls of power, but they're the ones that come together. They leapfrog. They have leapfrogging alliances, right? So, for instance, whether it's you think about farming communities like Via Campesina in Latin America or the Zapatistas, or if you think about the Red Nation, in North America in terms of very active indigenous or native communities. But then we can also look in the past. We can look at the anti-colonial movements and solidarity structures and how they came together throughout the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. I think those tend to be both ways that I think about praxis in terms of it is practice, but it is also theory with reflection, right? So you think, you read some more, you understand the knowledge behind it. So you don't just go do without thinking and reading and talking and understanding, but then you critically reflect. You have critical self-reflectivity, group reflexivity. You think about the ways how to intervene in the world. What do you learn from something and how do you incorporate that and how do you improve from that? So I don't have any specific, I don't want to identify only one group for people to go and rush to learn to, but then I'll conclude with one last thing. The youth climate movement in the last decade has been quite inspiring as well. So, we see Fridays for Future. We also see more not youth, but perhaps adult, like, Sunrise Movement in the US or Extinction Rebellion. Now we've got Scientist Rebellion. So you see a loose collection of people of different backgrounds, educational, occupational, different forms of communal relationships, but then also different identities come together because they believe that they can work across difference. Because none of these solidarities are homogenous. They're not just easy. Again, they didn't fall from the sky. They had to be worked at, right? Intentional solidarity building or being accomplices, good accomplices, means it takes a lot of work. It requires that deep listening. It requires that humility. And that means that you have to keep working at it. It's not a one and done. So I think what we're seeing is that the rise of young people, but then also people who've been at it, centuries ago. So there are many different sources we can learn and draw inspiration from. But we can also draw inspiration from, poetry and from oral tradition, from allegories, from stories, because they teach us something. And those are also points at which we can think about, learning and growing together and building different kinds of networks.
Thank you so much for the very insightful reply. Why I invite people on Zoom, especially that they have the opportunity to speak to speak also, to not to shy away from questions. I think that we have something that when we talk about climate and colonialism, and when we talk about colonialism, is there are some places that we cannot not mention in these talks, and places like Sudan, places like Congo, places like Gaza. And so my question is, also given your incredible work, not only academic, but also outreach on social media, do you have tips? Do you have a toolbox to make it clear as a born climate movement that anti-colonialism and that speaking out for injustice is necessary in these times, and it is part of the climate fight.
Yes, I think if you adopt a position of care, of ethical praxis, of decolonization, you notice where colonization exists and you start to overcome any fear of what it means to speak out. Now, of course, there are different levels of, threat and risks people are willing to take. I know many people who should or could take more risks, but they do not, to speak out. But in my mind, praxis means living that truth, right? It is not just in theory. Decolonization cannot just be an academic act. It is not a metaphor. So if you're not fighting against, ongoing colonial brutalities, whether it's Sudan or Congo or Palestine, what are you actually fighting for? What does that decolonization mean to you? Is it just in words, on paper, in a talk, for a degree, for a promotion, for a job, right? Then it becomes a metaphorical, extractive way of using the actual meaning of the term. But at the same time, I recognize that speaking out does not really lead to decolonization, but what it can do is it can inspire others to speak out. It can build that exactly that what we were talking about in the prior question in terms of a collective. It can build that kind of a critical mass of opposition. Because if we do not think about that expanding sense of care and reciprocity in terms of reducing harms, in terms of reducing violence to people and to the land and to water, which we're seeing, the kind of situation that we're seeing across many places, but specifically right now with the genocide, is in terms of, well, what does it mean for us to be educated folks, to be educators, to be students, to be activists, to be general public, to be anybody on this planet, to be an inhabitant of this planet at this point in time, to have lived an ethical life, to have thought about these issues deeply. And the reason why these are parts of a climate fight is because if you cannot stand up for the oppressed on these fronts, you're unlikely to be able to solve the climate problem. Because the climate change starts from the bottom up, and it is coming for you. So if you cannot stand up for those who are at the front lines now, figure out what those institutions mean. What does those geopolitical colonial power relationships mean? When it captures you, you will not know it. You will be caught up in it. So this is almost safeguard if you want to think very selfishly. So the same global sets of institutions, power relationships, mindsets that have given rise to colonialism and genocides of the past is the ongoing genocide now. It is the thing that birthed the climate crisis. So you have to see those connections. They're not divorced from each other, right? And if we cannot see those connections, then we cannot speak out against injustices. Because an injustice in one place is an injustice everywhere, as Martin Luther King in the US said several decades ago. So when we think about how can we be more brave, build more solidarity, we should not only think about just for climate, because climate is not this nebulous thing that exists in the sky. It is here in us, in every day, what we eat and drink, what we think, what we read, the politics, the news, and how we get the media to convince us to think in a certain way. I mean, look at the distortion of the media around what's happening right now, especially in the US. It is the same media that told people that climate change was not real, right? So we need to be able to see through the fog, see through the kind of discursive obfuscations, right? That blurring, that hiding away, or that deflection. And we need to be able to seek out sources that really expose the truth or multiple truths so that we can, formulate our own judgment in terms of what we can do. And then we take the actions we can within the confines of what we can do. But we have to leverage our relational privilege, position, and power. We all have, relative levels of privilege, position, and power. We can leverage that to do more good in the world. Because if we don't think about that, if we think, well, I will just die and I'll live this comfortable life. Well, we don't really know that, right? Because you don't know how long you will live and you don't know what will happen to your your children, grandchildren, or your family members. And even if you don't care about your children, grandchildren, and family members, you could at least think about the legacy you leave behind and the community you're part of.
Thank you. I think that is food for thought if you are good-hearted and think already of future generations or even for the legacy of oneself. So thank you for the different angles. We have from the different chat, different social media we are streaming on. We have a question that is, how can activist organizations best create this relationship and be great accomplices? I think among one organization and with other organizations. Speaking of scientists rebellion, it's not always easy to link to, for us, a organization made mostly of privileged people with a high education. It's not always easy to link to other organizations that maybe are more grassroots. So what are strategies to practice this care and this relationship work?
So I'm an academic, I'm a scholar activist. So I look at these issues rather than being involved on the day to day. But with the organizations that I have been involved in, I found that you have to have a multi-pronged approach to learning and then to outreach. So I think one way that became very clear is when you think about the climate justice marches or climate protests or the anti-war protests that's happening every weekend, against the genocide, how different groups come together because they see a bigger goal beyond themselves, something that's bigger and more than. So the whole is larger than the sum of its parts, right? So we learn from each other because together we agree on at least a few things, if not everything, and then you work out those issues. So I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, if I'm answering it correctly, but I think when we think about how groups can form those alliances, it is not easy. I will give you that. So when people just say, well, why don't these groups come together better? Well, have you worked with any two groups that are different or any two groups of people? So I think that's where a lot of the work that a lot of scholars have written about and some activist groups have written about is that, try not to do the moves to innocence. Meaning, don't forget the hard realities, how we are all culpable in different ways. Take responsibility, be humble, have humility, listen, and figure out how can you repair relationships that were broken or harmful in some way. And what does it mean to elevate voices rather than hear your own? So sometimes that means decentering our own selves to create space for others. And that is an act of solidarity and building alliances and networks, right? But also, I think one thing that doesn't get mentioned enough is that activist groups do not exist outside of knowledge production. They're producing knowledge at the same time they're reading knowledge, right? So when we talk about that divide between academia and activism, I defy that divide because I wish to inhabit both worlds. And the way I see it is that, sure, I can read more theory and more academic bookish knowledge, but I will do that translation work, or I will learn from what's happening on the ground and then take it back and say, well, theory doesn't fall from the sky. Theory is built from what's happening on the ground, right? So a lot of activist groups are very well read. They read what they're doing and they read the reflections back onto themselves. Then they do better. Just the way academics read and learn and modify and advance and publish again, yeah? So the way I'd like to think about the way we proceed is that we build these alliances, not just within activist groups, but activist groups, academic groups, but also like students who are often left out of this, right? Young people, but then also like just the average person. For instance, we have a lot of retired people who are great activists, decades ago. And now they're like, well, okay, this is new stuff for me to learn, but I care about this. They're reading and learning and doing. We're all reading and learning and doing. But the moment we stop reading and learning and doing is when we don't do well. We don't do things going forward well.
Thank you very much. I'll try to.
No, I just ended the screen sharing because I thought it was enough time for everyone to see that slide.
Yeah. I think we just since we have a couple of minutes left before you have to leave, we got a question that is actually also very interesting. Part of the what you called soft violence, I think, is silencing of people from media. And so our question is, how can these groups break into corporate media? What are possible strategies to tell our stories in the way that we want them to be told?
Oh, wow. I think it means having a different relationship to journalists. You have to get the message out, right? And this is not just written word, but it's also visual and verbal. One thing I found is that as climate investigative journalism has increased and media coverage has increased, there's more coverage of the kind of more disruptive, non-violent direct action, right? That a lot of people are paying attention because they target the corporations. But at the same time, if you write op-eds, right, editorials, and somehow break into the leading or hegemonic news, I mean, think about, excuse me, who controls the narrative of warfare? It's the warmongering fossil fuel military industrial complex, and they have a lot of pundits who write op-eds because they influence public perception and public opinion. So if we can collectively figure out how to get more into right into the mainstream, get them information out there, whether it's through talks like this, whether it's through marches like foot marches, whether it's through demonstrations, whether it's through non-violent direct action, something disruptive, but then also reach a wider base. And sometimes that involves, so it's multi-pronged strategies, right? And I think one of the ways that we can kind of confront that slow creeping violence is to elevate different voices, and then to call out the violence for what it is and not normalize it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it so much. We have this last minute. I see one hand raised. Marie, can someone unmute Marie? I can try. Oh, hello. Hello, Marie. Would you like to say your question?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes, I really appreciate your talk, and especially what you say about care and solidarity. And I wanted to maybe link that to the question of civil disobedience, because this is what we do as part of Scientist Rebellion. And then there's so many, it comes from a different place, right? I mean, how I was wondering how you articulate or how you see these different mode of being active that are just as different as building solidarity network and doing civil disobedience, which is work that can come from a place of anger or that can require some secrecy, for instance. Yeah, I was very curious to know on that. Thank you so much.
So, yeah, thank you for that question. So, in my mind, civil disobedience may seem angry, but it comes from a place of care, right? It's because you care about something that's bigger than you. You care about a wider cause that clearly that has been discussed and strategized, right? My hope is that it is discussed and strategized. You know, people have read about it. People have learned from the history because there was civil disobedience in the past. So when we think about care and solidarity networks that are more about repair, civil disobedience can seem as if it's a rupture, not a repair, but it's a different strategy. So I think there are different strategies in the same toolbox, but they come from a place of deep concern, a place of compassion for humans everywhere, for humans who look different from us, from species that may not serve our purpose right away, but have every right to exist. But at the same time, recognize that sometimes people are paying attention to the species and not the child. The 4-year-old mining coltan in the Congo, you know, instead they're focusing on the polar bear on the iceberg. And that is also a representation of very problematic understanding of climate justice, right? So it's both, it's not one or the other. But, you know, they have slightly different outcomes in terms of how they catch the wider attention. So I think civil disobedience can be part of that wider network. But you're right, different people can do different things. And I think this is where Scientist Rebellion has a very interesting position, because you're leveraging your positionality or identity, right? So it's often, so my friends in Scientist Rebellion will be white men in white lab coats being arrested, right? And they're leveraging that white masculinity in spaces of white supremacy. So if somebody like me went and got arrested, I would probably be denied bail, right? So it would cause a different kind of set of narratives. But we have to do what we can with what we have from where we are. And then we have to do better next time. So if this civil disobedience means that it's raising awareness, even if it's irking some people, well, how do we then have the conversation to get more people on side? Whereas, how do we, for instance, working with various anti-colonial indigenous communities, how do we teach what that means? And sometimes that looks different, right? That could be a summer camp for kids who learn things and they learn how to be in relation to one another, how to have a different relationship to the earth. But those same children can grow up to be angry and participate in civil disobedience. So I don't think civil disobedience should be seen the way it's often portrayed in the media as violent and disruptive. Yes, it's disruptive, but it is a form of political tactics. I mean, in all the literature on political strategy and political tactics, nonviolent civil disobedience exists to disrupt, but it also has a certain moral clarity to it. That moral clarity, therefore, needs to also maybe express the way it is about care and repair, about solidarity, but as a specific tactic that may not seem that way, at first glance.
Thank you, Farhana, for your extensive reply. So we had these, our interpreters are leaving, and also we had an agreement with Farhana that there was some kind of time constraint, and there is a very long question in the chat from reviewer two. I think that the best way to make justice to this very long comment and question is probably by sending it to Farhana, and with a contact from reviewer two in case you can reply. I think it will take 5 minutes to read the question. So I can put Farhana in touch with the author of this question that is very well written, but a bit extensive.
I can stay for like 5 more minutes if there are shorter questions I can answer.
Okay.
I can't quite see the questions, but maybe if we can just
I
wrap
think
up
it was a longer comment, but the question is that one question was highlighted in the comment. It was, when are we going to become clear that this is what we need to do in addition to what we are doing, and start doing it? Why are only few people in Western movements circles ever calling for what you were talking about? So these radical practices, even if it's becoming clear that it will likely become necessary anyway. So for example, you provided the example of Via Campesina and the Zapatistas. The question can be, when will we start organizing similar movements everywhere?
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't speak for everyone. That would be awesome, wouldn't it? If I could, I would be all supreme powerful person. No, it really depends on the capacity of people and the desire and the constraints of their life. And this is what capitalism does and colonialism does. It keeps people toiling away. Hold on the job, pay for your rent or your mortgage, buy your food. It's becoming increasingly more expensive. So you're constantly toiling away with less and less free time to do that, and that's the system. That's how it wants it. Why would it want more cognizant, aware, independent, right? More active citizenry? It wants a more controlled citizenry. That's just the way it kind of works. But even then, there's always these bubbles, right? There's these fissures that disrupt that. And we've seen that throughout time, as I mentioned, whether it's Via Campesina, Zapatistas, or any of the other forms of rebellion that have gone on in time. And I think one thing that's happening is that it exists everywhere, but the media often picks it up when it happens in the West. So when you see Western scientists in white lab coats chaining themselves to a bank in central London or in Manhattan, that makes global news. But you don't see the quiet protests of the smaller groups, across the sinking islands of the Pacific, or from the deltas of, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, or the mountaintops of the Himalayas, or from, the Amazon, who have been doing a form of quiet solidarity work for centuries. That is not very talked about. So I think we need to also therefore again read more broadly and widely to understand what's happening elsewhere, recognizing it's the more disruptive acts that do make more media attention. But I do agree that it has become more necessary to have more people be aware of these issues, to teach about them. And, our current institutions, our pop culture, what Hollywood tells us, what media tells us, what we tell each other, what social media, TikTok, everybody, there's a reinforcement. But you saw young people through the current genocide, they're disrupting the norm, right? In TikTok, they're bucking the trend. So we do see that people are sort of reading more widely. They're not fully absorbing everything being told to them, but at the same time, they're also being kind of conditioned to conform in certain ways. And I think this is where it's really tough to be prescriptive, and we can be innovative and creative. So if you think about how the arts and culture, they propel a form of resistance. If we go back and look at how the various forms of oral history or oral tradition were wiped out through colonization, and how some people have been trying to kind of recuperate that. It's not for just, oh, this is great, but it's a form of it's a liberation that we can think about, a collective liberation. If people in the past were able to do that, can envisage as a world that we're not completely under the yokels of the slave masters, right? We have it way better, and we can start to envision what we need to do. But it's just that we feel powerless because we've been told we are. And I think this is where, if we start to center, and facilitate and support, more marginalized voices and their agency, not just their voices, but their actions. And so sometimes that means, again, the kind of decentering ourselves, like stepping back. And that means that we together then are able to challenge and confront different systems and institutions. But at the same time, it has to be absolutely multi-pronged, and it has to be definitely well researched and well read, because we can't afford to have somebody shut something down just because there have been massive holes found in the logic, right? That moral clarity is really important. And I think this is where that kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary knowledge, dialogue, knowledge co-production together, because we learn from each other, and then sometimes we just keep quiet and we just listen and learn from other communities, or we read about them. And that's the only way forward. We have to learn from the past to heal ourselves going forward into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farhana, and I'm very happy that we managed to target many of the questions that were raised. So again, I really thank our guest, Professor Farhana Sultana, that for this very insightful, little bit more than an hour for the conversation with us. I know that many people of the organizing team enjoyed it as much as I did, because we were commenting together how nice and how strong your words were. And so thank you, Farhana, and thank to all the participants.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all the colleagues at Scientist Rebellion for this talk, for inviting people around the world, and for the work you do. And thank you everyone for joining us.
So with a great pleasure, then it comes a great responsibility. That is, after such an amazing talk, I will take the task of introducing Scientist Rebellion for a moment. So, of course, people are free to go. The official talk is finished, but after our talk, we usually take 10 minutes just to say what we do and who we are, who Scientist Rebellion is, very shortly. Something that came out of our talk today was when Farhana said that the whole is more than the sum of its part. I'm a theoretical physicist by job, so I can mostly work with metaphors, provide metaphors to this community. And in particle physics, the proton is most of the energy of the proton is made of the bonds between the smaller particles. So it's not the smaller particles that make much of the energy of the proton, but the links between these particles. And what are the bonds and the links? What are the reasons that bring us to fight in this rebellion? The reason is that we are there. We almost won. Virtually all countries agreed to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It's done. Everyone agreed. It's clear that we are about to do it. Everyone agreed that in 1992. So it is clear that today the emissions are 60% higher than they were then. We still need to fight. These were virtual words, and now actually we need to do something. Because the year 2023, and in particular the past 11 months, were record temperatures all around the globe. The last March was the warmest March we ever experienced. The last February was the warmest February we ever experienced, and so on and so forth, for 1 year. The last year was above the average for each month all year long. We broke all previous records. If you wonder what was the warmest January in the history, it was 2023. So 2024 actually now. So it's clear that we need to do something, not only because of the climate is an abstract entity, but because this is impacting the people. 20 million people are being displaced every year in the world. This is a statistic, 41 per hour, mainly women and children. This is the people that are being displaced every year in the world. And the impacts of the climate catastrophe are not equal, are distributed in this way, that the people that more contribute to emissions are the people that have less impact from what they are facing. In this plot, you see that the bottom 50% of the world emits much less, but has most of the relative losses. In particular, the top 10% has a very big emission, has a very big capacity to finance, to actually make this reparation possible, what we were talking about, but is the one that is not impacted by it. We know that we are not going in that direction. When we were reading the emissions report, the UN, I think that the authors of the UN, they have all my sympathy, because I think they are very desperate now. They wrote that our track at the moment is woefully inadequate. These were the words, woefully inadequate, from scientists working for the UN, for the emission report. So, I mean, we are not going to meet the 1.5 limits. We established this limit in like 20 years later with respect to 1992 during the COP in Paris. Yet we are not doing enough now, years later from the COP in Paris. And we have been saying this and telling this in Scientist Rebellion since the start of Scientist Rebellion. Our first campaign was to make clear that now we must act considering that 1.5 is that. And it's not anymore a feasible goal, not because of the physics, not because of the science, because of political will. That's the reason why we are at risk of not making it. We are not going to make to the limits that we did. If you look at this plot, you can really see that we must drastically change the way that we emit in order to match the goals. And instead, the projections are well beyond, in particular for gas. It's not a problem of science, it's not a problem of information, it's not a problem of communication. You can see that this is a plot where year by year the emissions of the CO2 were tracked. We reach, of course, another record very like this year. And you can see that conference and accord and agreements were done year after year, and yet the problem is not the information of the communication. It's a problem of power. The last conference of PARCC report, working in and doing a text analysis, is 28 pages. There is only one full stop in the 28 pages. It's a long sentence. This 28 pages sentence, absolutely not understandable, is the plan for the future. Is the most important document of last year. And yet it's something where the main subject of the sentence is stakeholders, as a word, a subject that doesn't mean anything. This is a problem of who we are putting the responsibility on. This is a problem of power, of elites profiting from the lack of action. We need, as scientists, to rethink in a political way our role. No one puts into question the fact that a scientist can be a consultant for a company. This is scientific consulting. they can be consultant for the government. Why? Whenever we rebel to power, we are not considered anymore as scientists. As scientists of opinion, we are consultant to the people. We put our bodies into actions with the people. And that's inside our role as scientists. We are, most of us, many of us are publicly funded. This is our part, should be part of our salary, to work for the people, to work with the people. This needs not only to be retaught, this needs to be taken into account. We need to be clear when we are criticized as not being scientific, when doing civil disobedience. This should be the norm for scientists. To care about the world that we study is something that underlines our work. Otherwise, why should we do it? Why are we doing science if we are not doing it for the planet, for the people, for the common good? Scientists Rebellion is a global movement formed by scientists and academics that believe that their role is this. Their political role, their ethical role, their scientific role is this, and therefore they engage in civil disobedience, protest, and disruption in our horizontal group. It's made of more than 1,000 scientists and many more allies in different countries. There are many ways of supporting us. You can join one of the induction talks to understand more in detail what are we doing, how are we working, and what are the ways of working with us. There is also a link. This is the people that support us and to help us sustain our work, support our actions. You can look at on our website or send just an email to understand how can you help and get in touch. This is our email and our website. There's a QR code, and this website is a very nice website. We had people working on it for a long time, and I think it's a precious resource to get if you want to understand more what can be your role in the big climate fight. So this was a very short introduction to what Scientists Rebellion is, and I thank you all very much for your participation and for coming here. We are open to questions if there are some very urgent questions, but otherwise I will say that we see each other in the next Scientists Rebellion talk or at an induction meeting. And now I'm just checking the chat to check that there are no urgent questions. Let me stop sharing. Not seeing any urgent questions. I thank all the audience for coming. I think I also am thanking the audience on Instagram, on Twitter, on the different platforms where we are streaming now, on YouTube. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to us. And I really wish you a nice week and to find your practice and to find your praxis of fight in your life. Have a nice week.